Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we're taking a break from our Plants vs. Zombies demake to do some research. Indeed, in our demake attempt, I've gone with an interesting approach to collisions, one I need to explore further in practice to make sure that the idea is even viable long term. Which brings us to today's plan, and a potentially new Let's Dev project altogether. The plan is to use the hypothetical collision approach from the Plants vs. Zombies demake, but on a more intense scale. To do this, we'll apply said approach to your typical top-down shooter, which again will use no objects other than the controller for the game. This will hopefully give us a better understanding of the code behavior, and maybe even open up new potential ideas in the process. Sounds pretty insane, I know, so let's not waste any more time and get to the coding. First up was the player struct and necessary variables we need to make them walk. Next up were the walk controls, which would be handled via function. Nothing new here, the same typical key control setup we've been using for a while now, and I also realize it's a little unnecessary to put this into a function. Anyway, with the controls set up, I then drew the player sprite to the screen and used the player struct data to determine sprite positioning. And so far so good. Had I not just went over the process, you'd never know that the player wasn't an object. A great first step, so it was back to the code to add a shoot function. The shoot function features the same cooldown system we've been using forever, only now instead of a general variable, it's pulling data from the player struct itself. But to create the projectile itself would require another function. This function would take the arguments provided and store them as struct data in a DS list specifically meant for projectiles. All that data was then used to display each projectile on the screen in the draw event. And well, the code worked a little too well since I forgot to set a cooldown. Regardless, this was working, and so back to the code I added a cooldown and fixed a few oversights. The results were far more in line with what we were expecting, and so now it was time to make these projectiles fly. A tick function was added, which unlike the demake, this ticker will count every frame. For each frame, we'd iterate through the projectile list and move it in the direction it's facing, which was determined when the projectile was quote-unquote spawned. And if the projectile's position was outside the room, we destroy the entry from the projectile list. To keep track of the state of our projectiles, I then drew the data to the screen. Testing showed everything was in fact working correctly, with projectiles firing like they typically would in your average top-down shooter. Again, arguably identical to what you'd expect using objects. So with all that working, we need some targets to shoot. An enemy constructor was created with variables for positioning and HP. Trust me, it'll eventually become a constructor. Anyway, in the tick code, I added a counter to spawn an enemy every 2 seconds. This would work similarly to the projectiles, with enemy struct data being added to their own enemy DS list. I then drew enemy sprites to the screen using said data from the enemy list. Next, I added a loop that would iterate through the enemy list to make them move. Using the same methods as in the past, only this time pulling from struct data instead, I had the enemies move towards the player. And yes, I'm aware I used point distance instead of direction. I realized this when testing and enemies decided to run everywhere but the player's position. So one fix later, and indeed our enemies were working like we needed them to, slowly moving ever so closer to the player's position. So with all the behaviors working as intended, we needed to get them to interact. Back in the code, enemy hurt state and cooldown variables were added to their structs. Then in the ticker, in the projectile loop, I did something a little crazy. I had each projectile entry iterate through the enemy list and determine the distance between projectile position and enemy position. If the distance was 0, then we do our usual hurt check for enemies, but again, instead of general variables, we're using struct data for the checks. And if an enemy has 0 health, their data is deleted from the enemy list. And before checking to see if this even worked, I wanted to make this quote-unquote collision check a general function I could reuse elsewhere. So it was moved to its own function and the ticker code was updated. And according to the data being drawn to the screen, this was all working. But the abundance of enemies was making it hard to actually eliminate enemies. So I added a limit to the enemy count, and just to make things obvious, when in the hurt state, enemy sprites would go solid white. This would allow me to actually eliminate enemies, which also became much more obvious with the added whiteout effect. And this meant, yeah, it was entirely possible to create a collision system using no actual objects. although it still needs some major tweaking. However, when checking out the frame rate data, it was again obvious this took its toll on performance. And though it's not noticeable, the amount of extra effort doesn't seem to outweigh the usage of objects, and the convenience that GameMaker's built-in functionality provides, which is totally understandable. I mean, if there's 10 projectiles and 10 enemies on screen, that's 100 individual checks being made per frame, though I'm sure I'm overthinking things to an extent. But nonetheless, I'm becoming quite fascinated with this concept. Now, this definitely puts into perspective the approach going forward in our Plants vs. Zombies demake, but I'm also thinking about continuing this project too, because there's a ton of new possibilities that have popped up during this session. For example, implementing tiles and tile collisions. Are there ways to improve and or optimize this quote-unquote custom collision code to make it more viable? This is absolutely an insane road to go down, but I think the learning experience will be worth the ride. But with that said, brings us to the end of this fascinating session into the weird depths of code testing and this episode of Let's Delve. So leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our little weird experiment in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.